Firstly, a slight correction. I'm not with the World Bank Institute. I was with the World Bank, but I'm not with them anymore either. I have had a long role in adaptation, and in fact, I was very much had a part in setting up the pilot program for climate resilience, the PPCR, at about the same time as the GCCA was being set up. And if you really want to discuss donor coordination, it would be good to get round, I think, a dinner table with some good Belgian beer, I should say, to talk through that in some detail. What I want to do here today is stick very much to what was asked for by the conveners of this meeting, and that is to introduce this issue of how we're approaching adaptation within the GCCA. And the organisers have prepared a brief summary of the material in the documentation that you have and that you've been asked to review. I'm going to go through that quickly. And then what I want to do is focus on some of the questions that we might be discussing in this morning's session. I want to focus on that area because I think that's where the most important interactions are going to happen. At a meeting like this, the opportunity for people to sit together and discuss ideas, discuss common issues, common problems, is really the fundamental purpose of these meetings. If we run through the background to what's happening in the adaptation area, I won't read the numbers up there. You can read them as well as I am. They're all in the various documentation. But essentially, there's a wide coverage of types of adaptation activities, wide coverage of countries, wide coverage with different approaches to how the projects are being set up. But the important point is that most of the projects are in their very early stages. And some people have said, well, of course, we can't say much as yet. But I think one lesson that we've learnt, certainly through the PPCR, and I think again here, is that it is critical to start sharing experiences and documenting lessons as soon as you start. Because starting is so often the most fundamentally difficult part of getting any program moving forward. And that's why we need to be sharing these lessons so early, because that's when we need the lessons the most. There are a number of examples. You've seen these. You all know your own examples, of course. This one is describing what's going on in Bhutan, which is, I think, a very well-structured adaptation approach. It's dealing with an adaptation action plan. It's dealing with linking that in, mainstreaming that into a national planning strategy. It's seeing how these can be reflected in the broad agricultural land use areas and adopting some sort of multi-sectoral approach. All the challenging things that we should be doing in this area are being attempted there. Some of the key issues that have come out of the analyses so far is that the GCCA has tended to build and choose the countries, etc., by building upon vulnerability analyses that have already been done, not trying to get back into this loop that we can get stuck in of going around and around asking what is vulnerable, who is most vulnerable, etc., etc. The simple fact is that every country in the world is vulnerable. There's very little point in demonstrating that. Every country in the world needs to do more than they're doing at the moment, and it is clear that the developing countries certainly need financial support in doing that. The GCCA is testing and demonstrating concrete and appropriate adaptation actions or measures. It's doing that to both demonstrate the appropriateness of these actions, but also to test them. And I'm going to come back to this question in a minute when we start talking about the session later this morning. GCCA has built upon NAPAs and other adaptation plans. This is the most logical thing to do, and I think it's been done in most cases. I am going to raise some questions about that later as well. GCCA is seeking to support adaptation at a strategic and sector-wide level. Of course, it's not achieving this in every case, nor should it attempt to achieve this in every case, but it does lead to the question, what is the most appropriate way of trying to deliver long-term adaptation action in countries? Not just support for it from the contributing or donor community, but how to actually achieve it within country. Clearly, we seek to involve local communities. Adaptation is almost always delivered ultimately at the local level. That's not to say that it can be done without having a supporting framework to do that, a delivery process that comes through both government, both national and local, and especially local, which is usually the forgotten partner in all of this. It also engages the private sector. Well, it's not engaging it very well at the moment, but that's what we should be doing. It also, of course, involves various NGOs and other civil society organisations. Clearly, adaptation cannot be delivered if it's not delivered within the broader framework of sustainability. Again, it's a challenge for us to think through this, but I think it's one which those of us who are involved in adaptation do tend to link to quite directly, but sometimes we may have to actually justify that in the wider community. And of course, we still need research, data collection, and the management of that information. But I'll make one little comment here, that one of my own mottos is, firstly, learn what you know. And that's really part of the role of these types of meetings. It's a chance to talk to people, to find out what is known elsewhere and that you can use effectively. So now I want to actually turn to some of the issues, and these are some of the questions for this morning's session. And I want to ask, are all of our basic concepts about implementing adaptation sound, or are some of them an illusion? And I'm asking you to challenge yourselves, to challenge each other on some of these issues and to think more deeply about them. And I think you're in a great position to do this because you are experiencing working with these concepts and these issues right now. Firstly, one of the questions we've asked to discuss this morning is, does your GCCA program build on, not implement, but build on the NAPA or other national adaptation plans, and if so, how? Well, I think there's a few questions there. Certainly we should build upon the NAPAs. They represent a lot of work, and they represent the identification of urgent and immediate needs. That is what the NAPAs were set up to do. The one question is, do the NAPAs need updating? Some countries finished their NAPAs, I've forgotten how many years it is now, 6 or 7 years ago, a number of years ago. Things have changed, priorities have changed, we have learnt a lot more. Do they need updating? Are the NAPAs at the right scale of ambition? The total request in the NAPAs is approximately $2 billion in total, of which actually one project accounts for almost a third of that. The Green Climate Fund, we may be doubtful about whether it will ever achieve its $100 billion per year and how much of that will come to adaptation. But we are, I think, in a position where we have to plan and work towards a future where there will be a flow of some billions, hopefully tens of billions of dollars for adaptation per year. So we're looking at a very, very different scale. Do we need the NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, as requested by the UNFCCC? What should they be? Are we likely to get into a situation where we're in this continuous planning, building frameworks, and never implementing? In fact, are adaptation strategies, that is, strategies about adaptation per se, are they counterproductive and inefficient? Or are they essential? I'm putting questions to you here, not viewpoints. There are lessons. Can you bring across lessons to today's session from yesterday's session, particularly the mainstreaming issue? So I'm challenging you to think widely about the adaptation itself. Another question is, does your GCCA program include pilot or demonstration projects, and which issues do they address? Well, one question is, why is a pilot necessary? Is it because we really have to learn how to do things and it's essentially a testing of an idea? Is it because there are not sufficient funds to actually implement a full program, so we call it a pilot? Or do you really face a problem that there is a lack of conviction that adaptation is needed or that adaptation will be effective? So ask, why is it that we're doing a pilot? And if it is a pilot for learning, are we truly testing different options, or are we simply demonstrating the viability of an option? Again, ask questions about what you're doing and whether we're doing things right, whether other people have different views on this and different ideas that you can put in place. Another question, what is being put in place to support learning and dissemination? This is really one of the questions for here. Are you ready to share some of the ways you're doing this? And can you share some of the lessons? It's the yellow sheets, which we will go through later. Is your GCCA program integrating into existing institutional structures? That is, are we achieving some sort of cross-sectional coordination? Why is it that so many adaptation activities are essentially standalone? Is this ever appropriate? Is it actually real that they are standalone? When might we be better actually simply focusing on adaptation and not worrying about trying to achieve a whole range of additional add-ons like cross-sectoral engagement, etc., etc. Does your program really have something in it which will leave a legacy that matters? Will it, for example, if you find that new practices, new guidelines, new standards are needed, do you have a process that will lead to changes in administrative rules, in procedures, and in the systems that are in use? Which activities are you finding that prove successful in strengthening capacities and institutions? Is internal information sharing sufficient? Is sensitising players to different goals and approaches needed? What is the role of, for example, SouthSouth Cooperation, which is essentially what we're seeing here in this meeting? Who are the major stakeholder groups? I put a long list there, but I will point out in particular again, local governments, which are often bypassed in this sort of work, but are often the weak point in the overall delivery system. How and what is the role of the NGOs in this process? We heard just from the Samara example how important NGOs are in intervening between government and community groups. Where is the private sector? How do you engage them? Are they a risk to some of your goals and ambitions? What's the role of technical specialists and researchers? Do the roles of some of these groups overlap? If so, where is that overlap useful and where is it inefficient? Who leads and when? Now, we've heard already, I'm sure we'll hear again, how important it is to have champions. But what if you have several champions with differing views? What is the outcome? Is it this, or is it more effective? And what are the effective communication paths? Do we basically leave it to random choice, which we see that in the top thing there where everyone tries to communicate with everyone else, but a few links don't form up? Do we set up a very structured linear system, or do we set up some sort of centralised body to help in communication? Also, don't forget, those who come to the adaptation session, there are other discussions going on. We just heard about the disaster risk reduction. What are the pros and cons of full integration? I won't go through all those points there, but my point here is simply to think about the other links. Don't let us fall into silos here because DRR is in one room and we're in another. One core question I think we have to keep asking ourselves, and it's not really on the agenda here at the moment, is how can we identify the adaptation component of any activity? The real question is, need we identify it? And I will give an answer here, yes, we do, because simply the way that some of the new funds are being set up, the Green Climate Fund, for example, is going to require you to identify the adaptation component. Personally, I think that's almost an impossibility, but we have to do it. So I'll close with that. There are things missing. MRV is a discussion that came up several times yesterday. The whole issue of loss and damage versus adaptation effort is there. And if you're wondering what the slide is and asking is there something missing, look very closely at the front tyre of that vehicle and you may see something extra there. But thank you very much.